Have you ever really stopped to think about who owns America? Not just the politicians or the billionaires you see on the news, but the true power structures that quietly shape everything from your mortgage rate to the price of your groceries. Some say the real owners are the same kind of people who once met secretly on Jekyll Island, the birthplace of the Federal Reserve. Others point to the so-called Holy Trinity of Wall Street asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who together control over $23 trillion in assets and proxy votes across almost every major U.S. company. But who really controls the country? Is it those who own the land, those who issue the money, those who manage the debt, or those who influence the votes? By the end of this video, you'll understand the layers of control that built the modern United States, from farmland and credit to corporations, politics, and digital data, and how they all connect to one another. Let's start with the first and oldest form of power, land. In the 1800s, owning land was the ultimate symbol of wealth and control. Under the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, Congress handed out 174 million acres of public land to private railroad companies. These weren't just thin strips of rail. They were massive swaths that sliced across new states. Behind the scenes, insiders created a company called Credit Mobilier. They quietly gifted discounted shares to powerful members of Congress to guarantee friendly laws and funding. When the scandal broke in 1872, it exposed how land grants could buy political loyalty and corporate power. Fast forward to today, and land still defines influence. Private owners now control about 60% of all U.S. land, over 1.3 billion acres. Some names you've probably never heard: the Emerson family, John Malone, and tech leaders like Bill Gates, who personally owns more than 200,000 acres of farmland across 18 states. Why does that matter? Because whoever owns the land often controls local tax revenue, voting districts, and even access to resources like water and agriculture. Land ownership still shapes the economic destiny of millions of Americans. If land was the first source of control, credit became the next. In 1910, a secret meeting of bankers and politicians took place on Jekyll Island. Out of that meeting came the framework for the Federal Reserve Act, passed 3 years later. That law created a central banking system with 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, the institutions that literally control the supply of U.S. money. The Fed gave commercial banks the power to use something called fractional reserve banking, meaning they could lend most of the money deposited with them while keeping only a small portion in reserve. For decades, if you deposited $100, the bank could loan out $90 and keep $10 in its vault. That $90 loan could be spent and redeposited elsewhere, creating even more credit. Through this multiplier effect, your $100 could generate up to $1,000 in new bank money across the system. Then in March 2020, something historic happened. The reserve requirement was dropped to 0%. That means banks no longer have to keep any minimum reserve. They can lend out almost everything. Today, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet exceeds $6 trillion, and it influences everything from mortgage rates to corporate borrowing costs, and even the value of your paycheck. Yet no U.S. president can fire the head of the Federal Reserve. If you control the supply of money, you control purchasing power itself, one of the most potent forms of ownership there is. Now let's move from banks to corporations, because control doesn't stop with the money supply. Enter the big three asset managers: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Together they manage roughly $23 trillion and hold proxy votes in about 90% of the U.S. stock market. Technically, they don't own these companies outright. Most of the shares belong to ordinary investors through retirement funds and ETFs, but because most people never vote their shares, the big three get to vote on our behalf. Those proxy votes decide who sits on boards of directors. And those boards decide executive pay, environmental policy, layoffs, mergers, and political lobbying. So while these firms may not own every company, they effectively control the direction of corporate America. It's quiet influence, exercised through boardrooms instead of ballots. Now let's talk about debt, because it's another invisible chain of ownership. As of 2025, U.S. federal debt exceeds $36 trillion, about 120% of the country's total GDP. Roughly 80% of that debt is held by public investors, including pension funds, banks, and foreign countries. Japan and China together hold about $1.8 trillion of U.S. treasuries, weigh around 30% of all foreign-owned debt. People often say, China owns America. But in truth, dumping those bonds would crash prices, skyrocket interest rates, and destroy the value of their own holdings. Ironically, America's biggest creditor is not China or Japan. It's the Federal Reserve itself, which owns over $6 trillion in treasuries. So when the U.S. borrows more money, the Fed effectively lends to the government using newly created dollars. It's a loop. The Fed creates credit, the Treasury borrows it, and taxpayers guarantee repayment through future taxes. If you hold Treasury bonds, you own a slice of that loop, a small claim on America's future productivity. But the more we borrow, the more we must pay in interest, and the harder it becomes to sustain. That's why some economists warn the system can't go on forever. Now let's look at politics, where money directly translates into influence. In the 2024 election cycle, just 100 billionaire families spent over $2.6 billion on federal races, nearly one-sixth of all political spending. The top 50 individual donors gave $2.5 billion themselves, with Republican contributions outweighing Democratic ones 2-1. Elon Musk donated hundreds of millions toward Trump-aligned causes. On the Democratic side, George Soros and his Open Society foundations poured tens of millions into state parties and advocacy groups. Add nearly $2 billion in untraceable dark money from nonprofits and shell organizations, and the true financial weight behind American politics becomes staggering. When so few fund so much of the political process, it raises a serious question. Can the system ever truly represent the average voter? Now we return to the central question. Who owns America? Is it the landowners who shape communities, the bankers who print the dollars, the asset managers who steer corporations, or the billionaires who bankroll elections? The answer depends on what kind of power you value. Some seek control over wealth, others crave control over policy or speech, but the most important form of power might be the one we all share: economic energy. Think about a dollar bill. It represents your time, your skills, your effort. You trade hours of your life for that piece of paper. But its value can be quietly drained away through inflation and when prices rise faster than your pay. We can't see that energy disappearing, but we feel it every time the grocery bill gets higher or our savings buy less. That's why the wealthy convert their dollars into things that hold value longer: real estate, stocks, gold, art, even digital assets. These aren't just investments. They're batteries for economic energy. A beachfront home, a rare painting, or a block of gold all command a premium because they store that energy efficiently over time. For example, in 2017, a famous Basquiat painting sold for $110 million. Back then, Bitcoin was $2,000 per coin, so that painting cost about 55,000 Bitcoins. By 2025, Bitcoin reached $117,000. Measured in Bitcoin, that same painting is now worth just 941 coins, a 98% loss in value when priced in a different form of energy. The same principle applies to real estate. Homes may rise in dollar terms but often lose value relative to harder assets that hold purchasing power more effectively. This doesn't mean everyone should rush to buy Bitcoin or gold. It means the truly powerful understand how to store the value of their time, to preserve the energy of their labor against systems that quietly erode it. So, who owns America? In one sense, everyone who works, invests, or saves has a piece of it. But in another sense, ownership belongs to those who understand how value moves, from land to money to corporations to data. Those who adapt to the next form of control tend to stay ahead. And maybe the real takeaway isn't about blaming anyone. It's about learning how to protect your own slice of freedom, your economic energy, before someone else quietly drains it away. If this deep dive helped you understand how wealth and power really operate, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Express EconGeoFinance Insights for more clear, eye-opening breakdowns of economics, geopolitics, and finance. I'd love to hear what you think, so drop a comment below and tell us, who do you believe really owns America?